Time now for our weekly partnership segment with The Lever. And joining us this week is a reporter from that outlet, one of my favorites, Matthew Cunningham Cook. Great to see you, sir.
Thanks so much for having me on, Krystal. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure. All right, so we have heard a lot about Doug Mastriano, who is the Republican nominee for governor in the state of Pennsylvania. Race is a lot closer than people would like. We've talked here about, is that January 6th? He was really key to Trump's fake electors schemes and election denialism, very extreme on abortion. But you dug into a part of his plans that I think is just as significant and important. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. Mastriano and Pennsylvania GOP plot war on workers. The GOP's Pennsylvania gubernatorial nominee is planning to crush unions if he wins on November 8th. So what is he saying he's planning to do here?
Yeah, I mean, what we see from his record is that he was one of just a third of his caucus in the Pennsylvania State Senate Republican caucus to vote against a very modest increase in the minimum wage in 2019. And then more recently, he pledged to use his network to support the passage of right to work in Pennsylvania. And basically, the labor movement calls right to work for less. It puts the open shop into law. So if you have a union representing you, you can choose whether or not to pay dues. Never mind the fact that that creates a financial death spiral for unions. And it means that basically the union is too weak to do anything meaningful in the shop. So that's why you see all these problems with low wages and poor working conditions in places like Mississippi and South Carolina, is because unions were never really able to get a deep base in the state thanks to right to work legislation. What we really think it showcases the importance here is that you can't separate extreme anti-democracy views from extreme anti-working class views and extreme anti-union views. So we've seen this time and time again. But unfortunately, besides outlets like Breaking Points or The Lever, frankly, there's a huge component of this rising extreme right that doesn't engage at all with this very important question of how does the extreme right relate to economics? How does it relate to labor and the working class?
Well, and in fact, you see Mastriano lazily called a populist, and maybe even calls himself that. I don't know, because he buys into election conspiracy theories. I don't know how that makes you a populist. In fact, to me, it's quite the opposite. That makes you anti-democracy. And to me, the bedrock of being populist is believing in democracy and believing in the will of the people versus the will of an elite class or a group of authoritarians. And so for me, it makes perfect philosophical sense that if you're basically opposed to democracy at the voting booth, you're also going to be opposed to any sort of democracy within the workplace, which is, unions at their best. That's the idea, is you're giving workers a little bit of a voice in their workplace. And obviously there's even more, some would call them radical. I think they're common sense ideas for co-ops and things like that, which would give workers even more of a say and a stake in their workplaces ultimately. So for me, it's not confusing at all to see that this instinct towards authoritarianism in our democratic institutions would go hand in glove with an instinct towards authoritarianism within our corporate institutions.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it's so funny, all of this, right-wing concern about censorship and free speech, some of which is legitimate. I'm not saying it's totally illegitimate. But it's where do Americans spend most of their time? I used to joke with a coworker of mine.
That's a great point.
Spend more time together than I spend with my family, And so it's really important to acknowledge the fact that in the workplace, there are no free speech rights. There are no rights to contest what's happening to you unless there's a union contract protecting you. And that's a huge portion of this whole story that I think is really missing. The other thing that I would just add is that, Pennsylvania Republicans' right to work applies to private sector unions. And Pennsylvania Republicans have also championed so-called paycheck protection laws, more like paycheck deception laws that place all of these really onerous requirements on public sector unions to be able to do their jobs. And so again, what's so interesting is, all of this extreme pro-police rhetoric, and sometimes you see pro-police and fire rhetoric from the Republicans. Meanwhile, they're attacking the unions.
Their unions, yep. That's a great point too. Well, and do you have a sense of, is the Republican caucus in the State House and Senate, are they entirely behind this? Because, at the national level, every Republican is against unions. Every Republican is in favor of so-called right-to-work legislation. But, having lived in states like Kentucky, having worked in states like West Virginia, at the state level, it's a little more complex. You still have some Republicans in state legislatures who are close with unions, who back union rights, who are opposed to right-to-work laws. And Pennsylvania being a state with, a deep union history and a decent size for, comparatively union population at this point, is there any of that sort of bipartisan support for unions found in the Pennsylvania State House or Senate?
It's getting smaller every year. I mean, the most pro-labor Republican in the State House, he got tired of the Tea Party control and was like, I'd rather be a county commissioner, So that's Gene DiGirolamo from suburban Bucks County. Brian Fitzpatrick, the congressman from Bucks County, is a Republican and also consistently gets labor support and was, I believe, one of one or two Republicans to vote for the PRO Act when it came this year. So there is a small group, but it's getting smaller and smaller. But again, it's so interesting how much that is different from the perspective that's painted by the corporate media, in the New York Times in particular, of kind of Trumpism, which is that this is like about Republicans getting into the working class. And it's like, actually, since Trump took over, almost all of the pro-worker Republicans in Pennsylvania have left, retired, lost, left the legislature. And that's a big kind of part of the story, that it's like, actually, the pro-worker Republicans tended to be pro-choice, tended to be moderate on immigration, tended to be in favor of kind of a broad idea of religious freedom and separation of church and state. That's really kind of what pro-working class Republicans look like. They don't really look like Trump or Mastriano.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, union support is at historic levels. In spite of the fact that unions have been crushed in oftentimes in a bipartisan way, but certainly led by the Republicans, you still have the American people who really believe in labor. I mean, in some ways, they've never believed in labor more. So you have a glaring example of a massive disconnect between the political elites of the Republican Party and even what the Republican base really wants and is looking for. So it's so important that you shine a light on this, Matthew. Thank you so much for this great reporting, and it's great to see you.
Thanks so much for having me on, Krystal.
Yeah, our pleasure. Thank you guys for watching. We'll have more for you later. Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.